Hey, Jamie.
How you doing?
I'm doing great. Does your local paper have like a rant and rave section?
Probably. What are you looking to rant or rave about?
Well, I enjoy looking at them. I'm like, these people are lunatics. However, I submitted one, so I guess I'm a lunatic, but it didn't get published. Mine was, I'm going to the Seattle Reign game and I wanted to buy some merch. And there's a store right across from Lumen Field for local teams that said 25% off, come on in. So I went in and I said, do you have any rain gear? And they said, we've got 3 scarves. That was it. And I'm like, but they're playing today. And this guy's like, yeah, I know. And so I wanted to rant to say, Seattle, team stores, have some respect for the women's sports that are here. And so then I'm walking down the street and I see a Krispy Kreme and it says, go Mariners and go Sounders. I'm like, well, where's the rain? So then I added that to my rant. Maybe my rant was too long or they didn't want to hear it. But instead, what got printed was, I can't stand it when people refer to dogs as fur babies. If your baby has fur, take them to a doctor. Otherwise, stop calling them fur babies. That's what got printed. Anyway, I feel like my rant was real, but I guess fur babies is real too.
I can't stand when people call them fur babies either. And just to be clear, I do not put food on the ground for my children.
That's good. Well, I was thinking about our guest today, Dr. Meisha Porter, and superintendents are often on the recipient end of rants. We get very few raves. Nobody calls us to say you're doing a bang-up job, but they do call superintendents to rant. And often those rants are in the paper or in social media and those types of things. I'm really interested in your thoughts today on our guest, Meisha Porter. Dr. Porter was the Chancellor of the New York City Schools, 1.1 million students. I mean, it's just a number that is just inconceivable. And
I wrote that down. Can I comment on that really quick?
Please.
So that was the first thing I wrote down. When you said that, it's the first thing out of your mouth, almost like, when you open the interview. I instantly went to Dr. Kishimoto. I was like, oh, this is beyond my comprehension. I do not understand the size of this.
So such an interesting. So I can't wait. I mean, she debuted her issue in her after action review for us and with us. She had not talked about it publicly before in terms of what happens when the press come and talk to you about something. You make a remark and then there's a firestorm afterwards. The most sort of huge, monumental rant of all time in terms of how the city of New York ranted about a decision she made. So how about this? Why don't we get into our conversation with Dr. Meisha Porter, former Chancellor of the New York City Public Schools, and then we'll come back afterwards and discuss. I'm Peter Stiepelman.
I'm Jamie Manson.
And you are listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendent and Leadership Podcast. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Dr. Meisha Porter is my guest. Dr. Porter is the Bronx Community Foundation's inaugural president and CEO, but previously she held the position of Chancellor of the New York City Department of Education, first Black woman to serve in New York City's Chancellor. And that's a big deal because you're talking about the largest school system in the nation. To put that into context for those who are listening, let me share what that means. She was responsible for educating 1.1 million students in over 1,800 schools. And prior to taking on that role as Chancellor, she served as the Bronx Executive Superintendent, where she was deeply invested in sharpening school leaders' equity lenses, building collaborative practices across schools. And she has served as the superintendent for Community School District Number 11 and as a teacher and a community coordinator and the principal of the Bronx School for Law, Government, and Justice. We're going to talk a little bit about that as well. But let me just begin with a welcome. So, Dr. Meisha Porter, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you.
It's such an honor to have you as a guest. And I must admit, I am really excited about segment 2 when you walk through a decision you made and then consider how it could have gone differently. Because really, if I was saying with 19,000 kids, like they said what? And they did what? I can only imagine what that looks like when you're juggling a staggering 1 million children. But we'll simply have to wait because we have other important things to talk about. For example, I mentioned that you're the Bronx Community Foundation's inaugural president and CEO, and it must have been gratifying to continue serving New Yorkers, especially in your home borough of the Bronx. And so would you tell us just a little bit about the Bronx Community Foundation?
Sure. Thank you. So the Bronx Community Foundation is the first and only community foundation in the borough of the Bronx. And if you know a little bit about the landscape of New York City, the Bronx is the blackest and brownest borough in New York City. It is home to a large, diverse population of people. It also is home to a lot of the problems that exist in our city exists multifold in the Bronx. high levels of food insecurity, high levels of lack of access to digital and technological spaces, many families who are food insecure, housing insecure, and has had some of the lowest academic performance rates. And I have had the privilege and pleasure of living, raising my family, and also leading in the Bronx for many years. And so I've seen the other side of that story, right? I've seen the other side of the power of the people of the borough of the Bronx. I've seen the other side of young people coming through challenging circumstances and doing amazing things. And so as I was transitioning out of New York City, I started to think about what I wanted to do with my time. And I wanted to do work that was important to me, meaningful to me, work that connected to who I was as a person. And I think what people don't know is I actually started my career, my professional journey in the nonprofit space. At 17 years old, I started working for Richard Kahn at the Urban Assembly and leading a youth group. And what that youth group did was looked at this 300 square block area in the Bronx and came up with innovative solutions to what was then called an empowerment zone. And ultimately, the school that I led grew out of that. And so to be back in this moment on the other side, leading the Bronx Community Foundation, for me, was like my story full circle, right? The foundation, community foundations are about place-based giving. They're also about participatory grant making. And so how do you bring people who are closest to the problem to the forefront to help think about solutions and decide where resources go to solve them? So it is an exciting place to be. And it met all of the things that were important to me post leaving my career in education.
Yeah, so many of us are familiar with the term an empowerment zone, or it sounds like you predated Jeffrey Canada with a children's zone, right?
Yep.
That's pretty, he owes you. But
and he's from the Bronx, so you're right, he owes me.
He does owe you. That's pretty
He
funny.
knows that, he's a friend. So
all right, good.
He will not
good. I didn't want to have to be the one to have to tell him. I didn't want to be the one to tell him. It's interesting, though, one of the themes that constantly comes back during this podcast conversation with leaders around the country is that very idea that you just mentioned, is that you make decisions with the people most impacted. And that's exactly what you're doing. Superintendents, they have these strategic plans or they have scorecards. It's a way to keep track of their progress. And I looked at the Bronx Community Foundation's 5 pillars: community, equity and justice, economic security, health, and digital equity. And you spoke a little bit about those things in my question about the foundation. I was curious, how are you measuring success? I think that would be something that leaders around the country are kind of interested in as they're sort of establishing their pillars. How do you describe your process to people who are interested?
That's a really good question. And some of it is being defined, right? Like when I took the job, I said the first thing I wanted to do was have conversations. And so we spent the last 6 months in the strategic planning process. We also spent the entire summer engaging residents around our pillars to think about and to envision the ideal Bronx. And we had conversations about all of those things, about food, about housing, about education, about digital equity. And we wanted to make sure, and so this is like our first success criteria. We engaged over 1,000 residents. We worked with over 17 nonprofits. We knew it wasn't our conversation to lead. It was our conversation to have in partnership. And so I think the first thing is that people came out and contributed to those conversations was a big indicator of success, right? As a school leader, right, I have had captured audiences. I didn't have to worry about how I would get people in a room. I just created the room and put the people in it, and I could ask them whatever I want. But this was folks voluntarily saying, I want to give of my time to, one, understand what this foundation is going to do for the borough, and two, inform what it does for the borough. And an initial success criteria was to, one, get nonprofits to partner with us on it. And then two, we initially were like 500 residents and we doubled that and exceeded that, but to really get residents in the room. Because one of the things we wanted to do was define community. And sometimes people define community as the folks who are elected, as the folks who run the businesses, right? As the folks who lead. And those people are all very important. But the other folks that are important are the folks that are impacted by the decisions that get made. And the first success criteria for us was defining that. What will come of it, and it will be defining further our success criteria, is identifying where we will invest as a grant maker, where we will be a convener, and where we will be strategic in programming. And so the foundation is ultimately going to do those 3 things. We're going to be a grant maker. We're going to be a grant maker who seeds and incubates ideas. And we're going to develop strategic programs in areas that we have expertise. And obviously, education will be one of them. digital equity because there's a need and a gap in the Bronx is one of them. And so I think it is evolving, our success criteria, and is evolving as we continue to have conversations with residents. So I would say my immediate one is continuing to engage residents and to kind of share this plan and build a level of investment for the Bronx. And I'll just add, I think as a philanthropist now, I tell people I'm not a philanthropist, I'm a Bronxist. I like that better. When I was a superintendent.
Well, they're philanthropic people in the Bronx anyway. So, it's almost like being redundant, right?
Exactly. When I was the superintendent, I loved being a principal. That was my favorite job. And when I was chancellor, I would tell people I'm the lead principal, right? So I always like to redefine the job to be the one I want it to be. But, the other success criteria is going to be, we have a big goal. We want to build $100 million foundation for the borough over the next 10 years. And so our success criteria is going to be, how do we get there and charting a pathway to that place?
These are really ambitious goals. It's fantastic. 2 takeaways that I heard as you were talking. One, the fact that you recognize that there are already entities in that space, in your borough, trying to do this work. And so serving as not the, aren't you lucky I'm here? Aren't you glad I arrived? And more as a convener and trying to almost approach it from that appreciative inquiry kind of approach, right? That we know as superintendents. What's going well? How do we get more of it? As opposed to we're here to fix things. And the second piece that I heard was this working to get a shared image. And I think that's something that superintendents are always working on, which is any word from morale to engagement. What do those words mean? And do we have a shared image so that we're all working on the same strategies? So for you, that word community, what does that mean? Is it the elected officials? Is it all of us, right? No one's coming to save us. We're going to save ourselves kind of thing, because that's what communities do. They take care of each other.
And I'll tell you, Peter, that is, I think, more true for the Bronx than a lot of places. The Bronx has a historic story of disinvestment. And I tell people all the time, 2 presidents came to the Bronx to use it as an example of urban blight. Jimmy Carter came to the Bronx and Ronald Reagan came to the Bronx.
And Reagan standing in front of like Co-op City?
Absolutely, right?
Yeah.
And they left. And each time that happened, folks in the borough didn't say, what are they going to do for us? Folks in the borough said, thanks for coming. Now we're going to start rebuilding our community, and we're going to physically start building our buildings back. We're going to shift this narrative for ourselves. And so I am so proud of the people of the Bronx and the way that they've shown up in service of themselves,
Amazing.
Of ourselves.
Right. In my book and in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there are 3 dimensions. And at the center of the model is a culture of deep learning. Mm-hmm. And in learning more about you, I learned that deeper learning, where teachers serve as activators and children have opportunities to explore their interests and engage in project-based learning, that deeper learning is important to you as well. And I know that you were involved, I think it was cohort 4, right?
Yes.
With the Deeper Learning Equity Fellowship.
Yes.
Yeah, look, I do my homework, Meisha.
You did a good job. That has been, you never know. And I think you probably notice, right? But you never know how a space is going to prepare you for the things that you will ultimately do. When I started Deeper Learning Fellow, and shout out to Big Picture Learning, who really led the fellowship, and I think cohort 7 is beginning. And I got to be in community with folks from all over the country who were thinking about what deeper learning meant for young people.
Yeah.
And in that space, I connected with a cross section of folks, education, nonprofit leaders, school-based leaders, system level leaders. And it really helped me to think about, to me, school is the center of community, but there's so much around it. There's so much richness around it that cultivates the opportunity to think about who are our partners at the building level, right?
So I would love to just talk about one in particular, which is the Bronx School for Law, Government, and Justice. Yeah. I mean, it just seems like everything you're describing right now, that this is like the model for that. I wonder, would you tell us just about that, what and how that sort of all came about, and what kids have the opportunity to do? Because as you talked about it in a number of places, I watched a few of your interviews as well. It's just, I want to send my kid there. It just seems like such an amazing place.
You should.
Well, we're not New York residents anymore, but yeah.
It's my happy place. So I told you I started as a youth organizer at 17 years old. And one of the things I got to do as a young person was design a school, the Bronx School for Law, Government, and Justice, the first urban assembly school. And the school I became the principal of, a teacher of, right? Did all these jobs in. But what was really unique about the Bronx School for Law, Government, and Justice was it grew out of the development of a new Supreme Court complex that was, it became a criminal court complex. We thought it was going to be a Supreme Court, but it was a criminal court complex that was being built in the Bronx. And young people rose up and said, we don't need another court. That's just more jails in our communities, but we don't have adequate schools. And so we came together and we started designing a school that would be connected to the courthouse. So young people would learn the inner workings of the court system, not by going through it, but by being in partnership with it. And so we had relationships with the court, with the district attorney. Actually, the Bronx district attorney, Darcel Clark, who's the district attorney now, was a judge and coached students on our mock trial team and worked with them. And so we really wrapped ourselves around who are the critical partners around us and how can we help them how can we connect them to bring real learning experiences to young people? We had probation officers and court officers. We had access to so many people who worked in the system that our young people learned so much about the system. Police officers, right? Our young people learned about careers they would want to pursue from the people who were in those careers. And then what happened also was because of where we were physically located, we shared a campus and continue to this day to share a campus with the criminal court complex. All of the folks who worked in those buildings became protectors of our kids, right? LGJ kids wear blue shirts and black slacks. Middle schoolers wear white shirts and black pants. And so they knew our kids. They knew them when they saw them. They knew they went to LGJ. And there became this whole community wrapped around the success of these young people who were pursuing learning.
Yeah, a brand of achievement, an identity. Yeah, that's super cool.
Yeah. So it was awesome. And one of my favorite places ever.
I can tell we could make just an entire episode on. Actually, I'll tell you, there's a law professor at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri. His name is David Mitchell, and he's got roots from the Bronx and from Manhattan. And he's a tort professor, and he does a class at the alternative high school. He does a street law class, and he does exactly that, real learning, mock trials. And it's pretty amazing. And that's just an episodic sort of one time. To think that this is part of a deep system, a whole school, you're going to have to tell him to go visit. See, it's pretty cool.
Yes, absolutely.
I'd like to ask you a question that I ask every guest who comes on the podcast. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
So I always say, right, our students show up perfectly imperfect at our doorsteps. And I think leaders are the same, right? It doesn't matter. When we show up in new spaces and new leadership positions, we come with all of the things from our prior positions. And I think we have to be comfortable and okay with that. Sometimes we feel this desire to be the perfect principal, the perfect superintendent, and that person doesn't exist. What I think exists is the opportunity to lead perfectly in your imperfectness. And so one of the things that I always thought about as a leader was I luckily got to move up in the ranks. And I always thought about what leader would I want if I was sitting in the seat that I just left, right? And I think the imperfect leader is always going back to that place of where I sat before. And I think imperfection is powerful because it helps you grapple with things you don't know. I think when we desire to be the perfect leader, then we set ourselves up for failure. And we set the systems and the people we lead up for failure. When I was a principal, when I first became a principal, I felt that pressure. I got to be the best. I got to be perfect. Everybody needs these things from me. I got to have the answers. And one day I said to my assistant principal, she asked me a question. I don't even remember the question. I was like, I don't know. I just don't know. And I need you all to start letting me say that because I find myself feeling pressured to answer things that I don't always have the answers to. And the answers that you all need to help me figure out. And I think the perfect leader feels like they have to have those answers. The imperfect leader is comfortable with their imperfections because as you work and develop those imperfections, you grow to a state of more perfected.
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being. And I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of An Imperfect Leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder. And after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class. And the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And my guest is Dr. Meisha Porter, former Chancellor of the New York City Department of Education, and now the President and CEO of the Bronx Community Foundation. And in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they had to make, and then we discuss it. Meisha, what happened?
The school calendar came out probably my second week officially as Chancellor. I was actually at a visit at my high school that I graduated from, so I was very excited to be there as Chancellor. And a reporter asked me, so tell us about the decision to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. And I did not know we had made that decision, but I gave a good answer. And I said, that's been a conversation that's been happening for some time, and we just had to get there. It was a good kind of press bite answer, but it wasn't the right answer. And it wasn't the right response in the moment. And I say that as my mistake because I didn't take time to understand not only where the question came from, but what was happening outside of the moment that I was literally standing in about that decision, right? The calendar dropped while I was at the school. It started this uproar across New York City about this change. And a lot of folks hadn't been a part of the decision-making process, right? Whether I agreed or disagreed was irrelevant. What was relevant was that there were many voices that didn't feel heard on a very sensitive matter and decision. I also didn't pay attention to what was coming and the implications of what was going to come as a result of this thing that I didn't realize was so big for so many people.
Okay, so here we go. So this is what I understand to be true, is that you've been named Chancellor, you're 2 weeks on the job, you're out and about as you need to be present and be seen, and how wonderful that you are at the high school where you graduated, right? And you get a question about the school calendar has been released, and you get a question about, so do you have a comment about changing Columbus Day? And in New York and in the 5 boroughs and in Long Island, there are parades for Columbus Day. I mean, that's a shift, right? So you get a question. So tell us about shifting it from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. And you give a good response, right? There's probably has been a lot of conversation around this topic, and it was time to move on. Okay, what got overlooked?
First of all, I didn't even realize that it had dropped that day. I didn't even realize the calendar was dropping, and I didn't realize how many people spend their lives waiting for the school calendar to drop. I really didn't. Even though I'm a parent, I did it myself. I'm like, okay, now we can plan Easter. Now we can plan vacations. But I just didn't realize how big it was for people. I didn't know it was dropping. And so that's first. The other thing that was overlooked, while I gave a press-worthy response, I didn't think about the political implications of the decision and the other work that I would have to do. And so I think the other thing that was overlooked was who's responsible for deciding that the calendar is going to drop, and who's responsible, ultimately me, right? But who in my immediate sphere of influence is responsible for making sure I know hot button items when something is dropping publicly. And so I just overlooked them, answered in the moment, and then turned around and was like, oh, dip.
I imagine, because my next question is, what'd you learn about relationships? And I imagine the moment you say, well, there have been a lot of conversations, that there are those who may not have been part of any conversations. Or, well, why were we excluded?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what I learned, right? I learned that the many conversations were internal conversations. They weren't external. They weren't with communities. They weren't with the communities who would be affected. And I very much believe, we don't have to agree. Sometimes we do this all the time, right? We have to make policy decisions that we know somebody's not going to agree with, right? I don't know that there's ever been a policy decision that everybody agreed with. But those conversations can't be internal. They just can't, right? And when it is so many, the calendar decision, the changing of the name of a holiday that means a lot to folks, you got to include those folks. You got to have conversations with the people that are impacted by the decision you make. You can't just have the conversation with people who are going to be excited about the decision. You have to have the conversation with people who are actually going to be angry with you about the decision.
What frustrated you?
I think what frustrated me was more about internal stuff. It was what I learned about the layers in a system. And it came down to there was one person on a team who made the change based on internal conversations for sure. Like it wasn't a singular decision, but didn't have the foresight to say, and I don't know that it was that person's responsibility. I'll tell you a funny story about that person too, but didn't think we have a new chancellor who is a Black woman, the first one in this role. This needs to be escalated, that this is going to drop. And I don't blame that person. I don't know that person was the responsible party, right? Because they didn't start the conversation. But I was frustrated by, there was no one around me who shared with me that was coming. So I could make a decision to be indifferent about it or not. I might have been indifferent about it because there was so many things I didn't realize about the calendar and right the communities that were going to be affected. I might have been indifferent about it, but I was frustrated about not owning that indifference or non-indifference.
Did you have a brain trust? Sort of a group of people that would come together?
Yeah, I did. And actually, when I was announced, it was very tight. It probably was the best kept secret in New York City, really. And it happened very quickly. It was like a conversation that started on a Thursday evening that resulted in a week later or the following Thursday, me being announced. So there were very few people that I was able to talk to about it.
Gotcha.
But when I was able to, there were 5 people who are really close to me, who've been really close on my journey, who we just went away and said, okay, now what are we going to do? And how are we going to support you in this role? The other thing that was important, and I think that's part of why you do this, right? Like just because of how we survived the superintendency, the chancellorship, or whatever it's called, wherever you are. The other thing that was important was I live and work in New York City. We were in the middle of an election cycle, and New York City is run by mayoral control. So while I had to do this job and I had to do it well, and it was a really important job to do, I also had to be thinking about what else I wanted to do. Because in a mayoral control system, the next mayor gets to decide who they want to be chancellor. And I respect that as a voter and as an educator in New York City. And so at the same time, I had to be thinking with my brain trust about, so what are the next steps for me as well?
So positioning yourself in terms of professionally, what are the things that are going to matter over this next 9 to 12 months? And I think for you it was about 9 months before Mayor Adams came in?
Yep.
Yeah. So that's an interesting sort of dynamic that most system leaders don't need to consider because they are elected by a board of education.
Yeah.
And not even elected, they're selected. So
yeah.
That's interesting. What could you have done differently?
Oh, wow.
Right. So my first question was what got overlooked, and sometimes that's by the system. And I feel like you really took it from a systems perspective of there are multiple layers. There's the internal system and the external system. Internally, we were having these conversations, clearly. There were individuals responsible for making these decisions, but that doesn't always talk about you, right? And so what could you have done differently?
I think one, I could have not answered the question. And again, like it goes back to my principal days when I felt like I have to have the answer. I think I could have not answered the question and got more information before I answered the question. I think that's the biggest thing that I would have done. Because I answered the question, I had to almost backtrack and figure out, was that actually the answer to the question? Mm-hmm. And so I think in retrospect, I would have not answered the question. I would have no commented the reporter or...
Like really big question. We're moving on to the next thing.
Yeah.
Make sure you get back in touch with me. I'd love to talk about this more with you. Or something along those lines. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really good learning for our superintendents around the nation who are asked by their local papers and sometimes from larger outlets for a comment. And it's okay to say, let me get back to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the end, what was something that was good that came out of the situation?
In the end, I had a lot of really important conversations. I learned a lot about different communities. We ultimately we didn't change it back to Columbus Day. We found, I think, what was a happy medium for many, not all. Definitely, it was important to me. And so we left it as Italian American Heritage Day and Indigenous Peoples Day. And so I think that was the right thing to do, because it was also at a time where the city and across the country, as is happening, right, was very sensitive about landmarks and statues and Columbus, the idea of Columbus sat in the center of that.
Italian heritage flying under a Spanish flag day.
Yep.
Okay. You see common ground, even if it doesn't always taste great, because what you're trying to do is demonstrate that you really are listening. And sometimes we get in trouble as soups when we do try to seek common ground. What advice would you give to an aspiring leader?
I think my first thing would be, what this podcast is about, right? You're not going to be perfect. Like, perfection is a desired state that you might sit in momentarily, but it is not a perpetual state. And don't try to live there. It's hard, it's painful. And so I would do my very best not to live there. I think the other advice I would give is really think about where you lead. There are people who want jobs and positions. And I think the biggest mistake is about landing in a place that isn't a good fit for you. Because it's the job you want, because it's the title you want, because it's the position you want. Fit, to me, is like the ultimate decider of a role. And so I think that, right, as people seek out these roles, they have to think about the fit. They got to think about what's the story of the leaders that have come before me. And I think the last thing that I would offer folks, and I am deeply committed to supporting women in the superintendency, particularly women of color. I think it can often be very dangerous for us. Think about your journey while you're on this journey. I had to do it, and not everyone has to do it, but we should be doing it. We should be thinking about whether you want to do the job until you retire, whether you want to do the job for a couple of years. Where do you want the job to take you? It's okay. It's not selfish to be selfless and thinking about what you want for yourself. And I think we often work in these spaces from a real aspirational space of what we want to do and who we want to be. And we don't think about or really center ourselves as the superintendency is sometimes a short journey. And where is it the journey to?
I almost felt like you were talking directly to me. You made me feel a lot better. My guest again today was Dr. Meisha Porter, former Chancellor of the New York City Department of Education, and now the president and CEO of the Bronx Community Foundation. You and we got a chance to meet each other a few months back, and I have so been looking forward to this conversation. And you didn't disappoint, I'll tell you that. And it sounds like I've got a story that no one else has heard yet about Indigenous Peoples Day and Italian American Heritage Day. So that's exciting. But truly, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your genuineness. I want to thank you for your human-centered approach to leading and learning. And I love this idea of being perfectly imperfect. This has been a real treat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter.
We're back, and look at this. In the time between our pre-conversation and then the conversation with Meisha Porter, Dr. Porter, you have now added the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast background. Way to go, bud.
I have. With the help of a competent superintendent, not a perfect one, but a competent superintendent, I was able to put it in place.
There you go. Well, I will tell you, I spent so much time on Zoom during the pandemic that I became somewhat of a super user, although I've not paid attention very much to the improvements since then. And so I know that there are all these new apps and things that are associated with it. And since they are not a sponsor, I'm not going to highlight them.
But they are welcome to be a sponsor. And in fact, Zoom, if you would like to leave a five-star recommendation.
Right. And you can even replace the O's with stars. Just be like, Z ***** M.
There you go. Let's talk about Dr. Porter. Let's talk about, God. So I actually want to start with, if you don't mind, this was such a great example. Dr. Porter is such a great example of and this is no shade on any guest, but there are some guests where I wish you had more time. For the things that Jamie wants to hear about, like, I'm your friend. I really enjoy you. I wanted to hear two New Yorkers talk about New York. That's what I wanted to hear. Her description of the Bronx resonated so deeply with me. She said, the Bronx is the blackest and brownest borough in New York City. It is home to a large, diverse population of people. It's also home to a lot of problems that exist in our city. And then she said, I have had the privilege and pleasure of living, raising my family, and also leading in the Bronx. So she says, I've seen the other side of the story. And you know that my hometown, Oakland, California, or not my hometown, my current town, where I've lived since the year 2000, it resonated for me. That's how I feel about Oakland. Like, I feel hurt and disappointed by Oakland, and there is no other place in the world that brings me joy than Oakland, California. And I loved her description of the Bronx. And it made me go, how would you describe Long Island? What would be your description of Long Island?
First of all, Long Island, it's the largest island on the continental U.S. So, I mean, it's 140 miles long. And so I can't describe it because it's everything from urban, suburban, and rural. The vast majority is somewhat suburban. However, rural, I mean, out in Suffolk County, farms, wineries, that's where the Hamptons are. I mean, so it's a combination of extreme wealth, extreme poverty, and everyone in between. Blue collar, white collar, fishermen, financiers. I don't know how to describe it. It's not a melting pot. It's certainly a bento box. And everyone's got their town and their pride. So someone says, where are you from? I say, Long Island. They go, oh, you're where? I go, South Shore. Like you have to say South Shore immediately, right? Because that distinguishes yourself from North Shore, the rich people. And then South Shore. Okay. Nassau County, Suffolk County. So I don't know how to describe Long Island.
You just did it. What are you talking about? You don't describe. You just gave me every.
And it's so much more conservative than I ever thought it was. I didn't realize how conservative Long Island was growing up in a fairly liberal community. No, the community wasn't. Growing up in a fairly liberal household. I mean, even my town was pretty conservative and always run by the same families. The Murray family, Mayor Murray and the Fire Chief Murray and everybody Murray. And they were members of the Rockville Links golf course, which was restricted. No Jews, no blacks, no Latinos. Unless we wanted to caddy, then we could come. In Long Island. Right. I mean, and it's interesting because, I mean, I remember going to the Voting Rights Act case in front of the Supreme Court. I actually got to go to hear the oral arguments. And I didn't realize that Brooklyn was also involved in that case as being supervised by the Justice Department for poor habits. You always think of the South as creating obstacles and restrictions. And Brooklyn was right in there.
Yeah, whatever. Racism's doing fine if anybody's worried about it. It's
thriving.
It's totally thriving.
Yeah, there'll be no telethon for racism.
No, there are no prizes. I always say that. I say that to leaders.
Give now, because I mean, this world. What would we do without racism?
Someone told me this. Who was I working with? Someone was one of my colleagues in Oregon. She said, "You told me this." I say to the leaders that there's no parade for this work. There's no parade for supporting the most marginalized and people that need support. You don't get balloons. No one. This is no accolades. It's only rants. And in fact, if you get a good number of rants, you probably are doing something right.
That's right.
All right. So that was interested in that. Go ahead. You want to bring something up?
What are some things that resonated for you in this conversation?
Well, can we talk about the school that she was principal at?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And it sounds like had a hand in designing even before that. And I love the fact, one point I remember I was the principal of a school where the school district wanted to place a program for children who really struggled within the school system. They wanted to put the program in my school, and it was already a school that families under No Child Left Behind would say, oh, that's a struggling school. We don't want our kid there. And I was like, this is not what we want in terms of the optics of an amazing school, amazing teachers. My own child went to that school and thrived. And so people had it all wrong. However, adding a behavior program into our school was only going to exacerbate or add fuel to the fire of what people thought of our school. And so it resonated when she said, we don't need a criminal court here. Right? When the kids said, we don't need, there's already a feeling about where we go to school and where we live. Let's try again.
Right.
I thought that took courage and leadership.
I wrote down, here's my note on it. I said, I am not even sure a descriptor like project-based learning applies here.
Let me push back on that because I think project-based learning is often very surface. And here, this was genuine project-based learning. Why not use this as the gold standard for project-based learning?
Sure. Okay. I just don't think it's a project. This is life, using life to be school. That's what this is. You learn while doing and being that. And it made me think of first, how many opportunities are out there in the world? And I've heard of those. I remember you describing one in Missouri that it was about outdoor ed. Or was connected to outdoor ed. How many of these exist in other professions anywhere else that are not highlighted? In terms of highlight the positive, how come we don't hear, how come I had never heard of this school? And maybe people in the Bronx have heard of this school, but how come it's not national?
Yeah. Why isn't it like High Tech High, where everyone is heading into? Right. I see what you're saying. Yeah. It ought to be. Just like there's a school in Southwest Missouri, often considered a very conservative place. And I guess it really challenged my own mindset that to be conservative doesn't mean that you can't be innovative, because a school district down there created a school within the local hospital, in the Mercy Hospital. And so 8th graders spend the entire year sort of this pre-med, and it's not just a learning about the medical profession, it's about all the pieces that go into running a hospital. So they learned about administration, they learned about governance, they learned about the technical pieces, the data scientists, the researchers, the actual doctors, the nurses, the techs, custodians, nutrition services, nutritionists. I mean, it was like amazing what they were able to accomplish. And I really wanted to do it. We got kind of close, and then the pandemic hit, which is usually what happens. Pandemic hit. And then now, who knows what's going to happen, because I'm sure some of their funding was tied to federal funding, and hospitals are probably going to have to jettison these sort of innovative programs. And that's a shame. But let's not focus on the dismal right now. Why don't we hear more of it? We ought to. We ought to figure out. I mean, there are great podcasts like Josh Rapoon's program, podcast on what schools could be, and Vikas Pota, who likes to highlight internationally schools doing innovative things, and Daniel Sobel, who I am really excited to get to interview. That's going to be coming up. And he also does inclusive education, but he's writing a book and having this international conference in Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan. I can't remember which stan it is now. That is highlighting the amazing things that are happening globally in education, because I think you're right. We have fallen victim to defending ourselves as opposed to highlighting and reclaiming the narrative of what schools are and can be.
Right. That's why every time I hear these stories, I am blown away by the idea of this school. And then I'm like, well, how come I keep being blown away? Shouldn't it be the opposite? I should be blown away when schools aren't innovative. And it's not like they aren't, like even the most very middle of the road school, somewhere in that school, innovation is happening. It's just not amplified.
Let me ask you a question. Why do you suppose that it is difficult for schools to innovate? What do you suppose, when I think of an iceberg sort of model, and there's the events, things that you see, there's patterns of behavior just below the water, and then there's the system structure. And then, of course, below that is mindsets, beliefs about things. And I think there's a belief that people would like to be innovative, but I think they're restricted by the system structure. And I'm kind of curious what you think that might be. And then I'm going to pose my thought.
Say before I give you my answer to that question,
Sure.
I would love to hear you define system structure.
Oh, yeah. So the policies, the protocols, the rules, the unwritten rules that govern how the system behaves. A system structure generates its behavior.
So of those words that you used, the phrase that I'd use is the unwritten rules part. Although I think the rules have an impact as well, the written rules. We're talking about human beings can't change quickly, adults particularly. Kids are faster. And as a result, the values that I have or the way I understand how something should work overrides in my brain innovation, which is unknown, which causes fear and shutdown, and takes practice, which is slow. So those two things prevent me from changing the system. So basically, I just keep doing what I already know how to do and or tweaking the outside of that system without ever disrupting the system from the core.
So status quo. I mean, the system, the structure of status quo is we understand it. We know the rules, the written and unwritten. And so we're comfortable there. And students, children are willing to disrupt it because they would like to see something different. And adults are comfortable with the known. They're uncomfortable with the unknown.
And I don't think actually adults really realize how comfortable they are with the known.
Like, right. Until the waters are disturbed. And they're like, I don't like this. I don't like this.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Well, let me offer, I agree with you. And there is a disincentive for leaders to try to innovate because the structure, the system, look back to No Child Left Behind during the Bush years, said everything is based on your test scores. And so there was a shift away from innovation and towards test prep, because then schools were graded and those grades were published. I talked to a superintendent yesterday who was excited, for every good reason, to say we're an A district again. What's the incentive to innovate if funding, oversight, criticism, celebration is all tied to whether or not you're an A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, F. And so until we begin to really rethink how we want schools to be celebrated, rewarded, encouraged, because I actually believe those superintendents that go for the innovation will also see great results on those tests, because you're teaching those deeper skills, the critical thinking, the creativity, the collaboration, the shared leadership, all the things that we know. However, it takes a lot of work. And then I think that gets to the mindset of an individual who then says, hey, I don't want to shift. The status quo, I understand. I can hand out these test prep books. We can go over them. We could drill and kill. And I don't understand why kids stop coming to school. I'll tell you why. That's not exciting for them to sit for 6 to 7 hours a day doing your test prep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think it's an and. That's what I mean by the system structure.
You think it's a what?
It's an and. What you described in terms of adult behavior, and the system structure generates that behavior because federal and state governments, those who have no experience doing education, pass laws to require schools to focus on the wrong things.
These conversations about the system and the difficulty in changing the system is what propels my work and makes me extremely depressed, which takes me to, I want to talk about her after action review and the way in which she reflected on it. And I remember this. I remember this in the news. I remember this coming out. So this was not, as an example, I wish the Bronx school was more public, but instead what's more public is Indigenous Peoples Day in New York City schools. That's what went national.
Yes. And the way that it was sensationalized was attack on Italian Americans, attack on Columbus Day.
Attack on Columbus Day.
I mean, it reminds me actually of Oakland when I was just getting there, and attack on English. We're going to teach Ebonics. The teachers are they're all being trained in Ebonics. I'm like, what are you talking about? What Oakland was trying to do was cultural awareness, to understand that children, a good number from the schools, are coming to school with non-academic English as it's understood. There shouldn't be a hierarchy on language. However, there is. And that teachers shouldn't be dismissing kids to say, what you're saying is wrong or how you're saying is wrong. Because a child is saying, well, this is the language of love. And you're telling me it's wrong? No, you're wrong. So you want to build relationships? Understand our kids and their culture. And instead it was packaged as an attack on English of some sort.
If you want to dig into the political movement of the Ebonics movement in Oakland, I would be happy to talk about that.
That probably
my
is
background of hold on the podcast. Dr. Vera Nobles and her linguistic take on Ebonics and why that was used. Oh, I'd be happy to talk about that. I think it's riveting. I think it's truly riveting.
I mean, as a new teacher, I went to trainings. It was fascinating to learn the actual system of language is rule-based. And anyone claiming it's lazy English, is ignorant at a minimum, racist at worst.
And politically, there's a political benefit to calling it slang or any other descriptor. That language is not actually, by linguistic definitions, languages are not defined that way. Languages are defined by politics. So who gets a language and who gets a dialect is all politics.
Fascinating. Yeah, because we're all still speaking Middle English around here,
I mean,
go read some Chaucer.
I want to hear the Long Island guy and the Bronx woman talk about language in New York. I'd listen to that.
That's funny.
So let's get back. Let's talk about this. First of all, as a superintendent, what was your Indigenous Peoples Day decision? What was this for you in Columbia?
This was not something the schools had to take on. This was something actually the city had Indigenous Peoples Day / Columbus Day. I think it was just, it was pretty benign. I mean, when I lived in the Bay Area, I remember all the parking meters said Indigenous Peoples Day. There's no Columbus Day. Right. The only thing I can sort of relate it to was changing an elementary school's name from Robert E. Lee to Locust Street. and the arguments of your canceling history to some extent, I guess. In New York, it was less about canceling history and canceling or attacking Italian American culture. And Italian Americans make up a large part of New York. And so with parades, I mean, there's no Columbus Day parade in Columbia, Missouri, even though it's named after Columbus, I guess. So, but the parades and I think as Dr. Porter said, it was less about making a decision and as much as not including the people impacted by it. Because I've talked to people who know her who were like, "Oh, I remember that," and I, who are Italian, and said, it was a surprise, it was a shock kind of thing.
I mean, her after action review, and I feel like this happened in her conversation a lot. This comes full circle a lot. And first, working for the Bronx Community Foundation, where she was working when she was 17 years old, and now leading the organization. To this example of where she opens with, "You've got to be connected to the people most impacted." Well, this example in her after action review, she wasn't connected to the people most impacted. And it actually made me connect to a piece of research I read about when human beings feel a part of a group, which we all look for. Like it's a hardwired piece. It's part of the reason why as a species we survived is that we are collective. We need to be connected to people. That when we feel a part of a group and that group is challenged is challenged, disrespected, whatever, we will be defensive. We will try and fight for the group that we're a part of. We won't see the flaws in our own group and or let go of that group unless there is another group that welcomes us. This example of going from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day without talking to any Italian Americans in New York is a prime example of an attack without a welcome. We're just going to change it. Now, with that said, please note, Indigenous peoples were never welcomed. Never. So the indignation that Italian folks are feeling has been indignation that Indigenous peoples have felt since they were eliminated.
Since first contact.
You got it. You got it.
And ongoing.
You got it. So in some ways, if you're going down the path of you had it coming, you had it coming. But is that how we should live now that we live in the same community?
Yeah, and here's the thing. I'm not even sure that people were celebrating Columbus as much as Italian heritage, right? And
so that's nothing. No,
right.
Columbus is not the thing. In fact, if you asked plenty of Italian Americans in New York, they'd be like, "Yeah, I don't love the Columbus part of it, but I love who I am.
Right.
I love where I'm from.
I don't fly
my family
under a Spanish flag."
Yeah, exactly.
I've never been to Segovia.
Exactly.
I've seen some Spanish history.
It's not about that. It's not about that. And so it's the welcome part that's missing in this conversation. That is so eye-opening and makes total sense. I really appreciate your take on this. Yeah, I loved it. I loved the research. I was riveted by it. I was like, that makes perfect sense to me. And it's happened to me, and I've done it to others, both. This was what makes me imperfect. I'm trying not to do it to others.
A lot to think about. I'm so glad that we had this opportunity to talk with Dr. Porter. So glad I got to bring it back for those who may have missed it.
Thank you for bringing it
you're
to
welcome.
Because I wouldn't have listened to it.
No, of course. I mean, that's the whole point of taking some of this time this summer and really highlighting some of the really powerful voices and deep reflections that we've heard. And so, at any rate, thank you so much for your reflections and your time. And I can't wait to see you next week.
Yeah, I'll see you next week. Oh, by the way, we said this earlier. Don't forget 5 stars. That would be really helpful.
I know. It'd be really nice. It'd be really nice. I mean, come on. I say forget.
Come on. I can't do that.
That's more Brooklyn.
Make that.
That's more Brooklyn.
Yeah, I would say something. It would probably, for me, it would sound something like, "Ay, mijito, we should do 5 stars." Something like that.
5 estrellas. You've been listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. We are proud to be imperfect leaders, so join us next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast.